Harvard Divinity School.
100 Years Rudolf Steiner, December 15th and 16th, 2025.
I am delighted to welcome Lucas Dreier, who is both a scholar of social anthropology at the University of St. Andrews and a longtime activist for ethical action in the face of planetary imbalance. Lucas's anthropological fieldwork is with the Kogi people of Colombia, and his talk is called From Rudolf Steiner to Anthroposophy, Spiritual Science Comes of Age. Lucas.
Thank you all very much. I'm honored to be here. And as Dan knows from behind the scenes, I sort of had thoughts along the way that I trying to switch panels and trying to figure out how do I actually address this question. And until the last minute, what I want to share has gone through lots of changes. And I realized just before this that the latest version is much too long. So I'm going to start my stopwatch, and I'm going to be improvising about how to share what is hopefully most important, and it's going to involve quite a bit of sort of preamble. It might seem like I'm avoiding the difficult topic at hand, but I hope that ultimately it'll feel like that's worthwhile, and particularly in terms of trying to complement the other presentations that some of you have heard. So there was a wonderful panel at 1 o'clock in the Cotter Room with some very stimulating presentations addressing this topic of race and racism and how do we deal with this in anthroposophy. And so I recommend, if you haven't seen those presentations, seeing the recordings. And just in terms of reference for this panel, maybe some things will be repeated and that's fine, but just a little bit of a sense of what's been covered for anyone who wasn't there. Corey Eichmann went into quite a lot of depth of looking at precisely what Rudolf Steiner said, especially in the early years, some of these statements that he spoke about struggling with, and he offered some imaginations of new ways of thinking about that. There was also a presentation virtually from, is it Robert Kalia? Sorry if I'm forgetting the first name, who shared, for example, some experiences from people engaging with anthroposophy who felt personally harmed by a lack of sensitivity around how anthroposophists in certain contexts were approaching these questions. And so I think that speaks to perhaps part of why this panel is a part of this conference. Professor Dan McCannon, in his book, Eco-Alchemy, he addresses this question from a kind of nuanced perspective, looking at the different sides of it. But one of the things is kind of, how does this live in anthroposophy? How do people respond to it? How do they address this legacy? And so it's clearly something living. And for me personally, there are other areas that I feel perhaps more of an immediate passion about, how anthroposophy could be addressing some of the current issues facing the world today. How do we address our relationship with technology that's changing, with artificial intelligence, with the natural world? And I see so much opportunity out of anthroposophy for addressing those questions. But I also understand that there are some of these other questions that might not be as exciting, but that do need to be looked at. And part of my basic, what I hope to share, is that I see it as very much the spirit of anthroposophy to address those questions in a living way that is truly universal and that truly brings together different perspectives and makes people feel included. And I actually, partly in that spirit, I want to begin with taking a moment to acknowledge where we are. So actually, Harvard University's Native American program has developed, through dialogue with local Native American representatives, a suggested land acknowledgement. So I'll read that. Harvard University is located on the traditional and ancestral land, the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past and present, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. And I think it's valuable in this time of what in anthroposophy we call the consciousness soul or the spiritual soul, bringing consciousness to where we are, what is the history in this place where we stand, what kind of human relationships are involved here. So I welcome that impulse. We're also, in terms of the history of this place, and Professor Dan McCannon, who's hosting us, I won't give his full official title, but he's the Emerson Professor. And in the earlier panel at 1 p.m., one of the speakers, Gopi, referred to Emerson. One of his famous speeches was at the Harvard Divinity School to the graduating class. He was a young man, I think about 35. This was in 1838. And part of his message there, I want to quote, because I think it speaks to an important aspect of anthroposophy that I think is very important to bear in mind when addressing some of the questions around this panel. And so he speaks about truth and authority and taking the kind of dogmas and doctrines from people of authority, and he argues for this kind of individual measure of truth. So he says that truth cannot be received at second hand. Truly speaking, it or what another says is not instruction, but provocation that I can receive from another soul. What he announces, I must find true in me or wholly reject. And on his word, or as his second, be he who he may, I can accept nothing. And a few years later, in his even more famous essay or on self-reliance, he took this concept even further, you could say. So not only do I find what is true for myself, but what I found true for myself in the past doesn't determine how I see the world today. And so there's this famous phrase, a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. So we don't need to be determined by what we thought before. We're ever looking anew for what is true, what rings true. And certainly there are many resonances here with different statements from Rudolf Steiner. I won't go into all of them. There's obvious resonance with the philosophy of freedom, with the capacity for feeling judgment, with the capacity for using logic to assess what a spiritual researcher shares. And there's also this fascinating talk that Rudolf Steiner gave in 1911 when he went to an academic conference in Bologna in Italy, and he tried to kind of explain in terms academics would understand the kind of epistemological framework for spiritual research. And I think this is something Ashton's going to share about, so I don't want to take away anything from what you're going to share, but there is this notion, which was also in your abstract, of treating what a spiritual researcher says as kind of traveler's reports of some place we haven't seen, but we can hear what they say. And so that's possibly another resonance with this idea of taking what someone says as a provocation, something to contemplate. But I actually want to bring in another anthroposophical voice, not of Steiner, but his close collaborator, Ida Wegman. And now I have to make sure I don't spend too long on these preambles, but I do think it's important. So in 1933, a momentous year, which has been mentioned in at least one of the panels already, she gave a talk which has been published as kind of an essay in this book in English, The Mysteries. The talk is called Turning Points in the evolution of mankind or humankind. And she speaks quite compellingly there. She gives a picture of how, whereas in ancient times, the kind of healthy cosmic impulses that are needed in the world came through what she calls the mystery centers or the mystery schools. And she says how nowadays they can only come through individuals. Each individual carries an impulse, and it's in many ways the paramount task of anthroposophy to facilitate bringing those impulses into the world. And she says in quite stark terms, evil would result if dogma were to enter anthroposophy and unfree, firmly established ideas were to be laid down instead of an unfettered spiritual life being allowed. So I feel that this impulse that I think lives within anthroposophy and that also lives in Emerson of a kind of, you might call it a sort of epistemological individualism, I think that's vital in how we address statements from a spiritual researcher, whoever they may be. And at the risk of going even more into a background, I'll try to just briefly address what I think is also important about the kind of epistemology and methodology that we bring to our anthroposophical research and that informs ostensibly what Rudolf Steiner shared, what is his legacy that we're coming to terms with 100 years later. And there was for example, in one of the panels yesterday from Nathaniel Williams, this picture of Goethean research, which has also been addressed by others, but this idea of how through a series of observations from different perspectives, whether it be the sunset or a plant or an economic phenomenon, we gradually arrive at the full picture. And a number of speakers have already addressed this fascinating work, Anthroposophy, a fragment, where there's also this idea of anthroposophical knowledge being built up out of a series of perspectives. He uses the analogy of a tree. So multiple perspectives that are true in and of themselves can only really reach truth in aggregate. And that could then even be taken further in this lecture, which has also been addressed in one of the other panels, Cosmic and Human Thought, where there's this sense that to really get at the truth, you would need these kind of 12 different world outlooks permutated through 7 different moods connected to the planets and 3 different tones connected to sun, moon, and earth. So to build up a picture of the truth always requires not just taking one perspective or one statement, but living into a fuller picture. And this, I don't have time to go into it, but in my work with the Kogi indigenous people, this is something that for them is kind of obvious. So they work with sacred sites that are almost like what we might call oracles, where if they need to address an important question, they have to bring representatives of these different sacred sites, of these different oracles, because you couldn't possibly get the truth from just one of them. And it's my imagination, I don't know how well-founded, but I think that in a way, turn to this question of what is anthroposophy, and even this question a bit more abstract, what is the being anthroposophy, or we might say anthroposophia, that in a certain way, when we're building towards that full picture, that's maybe a little bit of an indication of what that is. So in our beholding of the world, anthroposophically, the picture that arises is this being anthroposophy coming into cognition, speaking to us in some way to give us a picture of the world. And interestingly, Rudolf Steiner spoke very rarely of this being, but in one of the places where he spoke of this being, there's a particular connection to this impulse of universalism and cosmopolitanism. somehow part of the fiber of this being. So in 1923, several months before the Christmas conference, he spoke of the living being Anthroposophy, sometimes translated as Anthroposophia. And he said, he addressed this theosophic ideal. Thank you, 5 minutes. Okay. He addressed this theosophical ideal of universal brotherhood. So the Theosophical Society had this ideal. And he said that when Anthroposophy herself is regarded as a living, supersensible, invisible human being going about amongst the anthroposophists, then perhaps there may be less talk of brotherhood, less talk of universal love of mankind, but this love will be more living in human hearts. And the world will see from the very tone in which they speak of that which binds them together in anthroposophy. So I just thought it was interesting that in this one of these few places where he speaks about what is this being that's informing our work, there's this principle of universalism, or that's how I understand it. So in the few minutes that I have left, I'm just going to skip over some sections. Many of you are probably familiar. There's a fascinating lecture, I'll just very briefly paraphrase, in the series of lectures called The Universal Human, where there's also this idea that part of the whole purpose of anthroposophy is to prepare for what gets called in anthroposophy the sixth epoch. One of the ideals of which is to completely overcome racial distinction. And in that particular lecture, he even goes so far as to say, already for anthroposophy, it has no meaning. Because the task of anthroposophy is to prepare, one of the tasks is to prepare ahead of time that future state where racial distinctions will have no meaning. There will be this deepened capacity for empathy, for compassion. And so it's part of the task of anthroposophy to prepare that. And so this being, he also says, has her own evolution. And he says that already then in 1909, he talks about racial distinction no longer having any real meaning. And here we are 100 years later. So how do we take up that question now? How much meaning does it have now? And also, how has this impulse grown in these 100 years? And so I just want to briefly suggest a few ways that this could be, this work towards a renewed anthroposophy could be imagined. This methodology of spiritual science, which I won't go into the background I was going to go into, this impulse of compassion and empathy that's so important for this future state we're working towards, I think that in sharing the results of spiritual research, which was this new methodology that had never been created before, spiritual science, there's a place for greater sensitivity around how will the results of this research live in the people we're speaking to? How will the results of this research impact the world? In academic research, we have ethical reviews to think through what are going to be the results of this research. And spiritual research, if it wants to be a valid system of research, spiritual science, we really need to think in modern ways about what are the impacts going to be of this research, of sharing these results. And since my time is running out, I'm looking at Marcelo. I just want to mention that part of why I didn't get enough sleep last night is that he shared about this book he's written that I hadn't known about, that I was reading last night. And I just want to mention that I think it's really important as part of this conversation. He has a book called Ethical Universalism that addresses this question. I just want to mention that because there's a lot of really important work contributing to carrying these questions forward. 1 minute. my own provocation in naming this talk, which I wasn't able to finish, but from Rudolf Steiner to Anthroposophy, I'm not trying to distance Anthroposophy from Rudolf Steiner, but I rather see it as his impulse to create a system of research that can be taken up by all of us. And I think the sensibilities that are required to allow Anthroposophy to do her work in the world mean that we can't be limited by a need to take anything Steiner said, whether about race, whether about Judaism, whether about any question. These are not doctrines. We have to think, what resonates for us now? What resonates as true? What is a healthy impulse for the world? That's the impulse of Anthroposophy as a living being. And to do justice to Rudolf Steiner's legacy, that's the impulse that needs to guide us now. Thank you.
Sponsored by the Program for the Evolution of Spirituality.
Copyright 2023, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.